Joining us now in our Melbourne studio is Australia's Chief Scientist, Professor Penny Sackett. Thanks for being there.
Hello, Tony. Thank you.
Now, Australia's always been a land of droughts and flooding rains, and we've just come out of a long drought. Now we've got the floods again, it seems. So what do you say to the inevitable argument that this is proof that global warming is a myth?
Well, actually, it's exactly what global warming, what we would expect from global warming, and what we know about climate variability generally. This particular incident is most probably related to a strong La Nina. As your viewers have just heard, La Ninas and El Ninos, of course, have been going on for ages, but the frequency and the severity of these sorts of events we do expect to increase, whether they be floods or whether they be droughts. These are the sorts of things that we expect to increase in severity as the globe warms.
Do you believe then there is a connection between the extremes or the extreme events in the Southern Oscillation Index and overarching global warming? Is there any proof of that?
What we do know is that we can expect an increase in the severity and the frequency of extreme events. What we cannot say is that any particular single event is related to global warming. It's rather statistically the number and the severity of them.
Now, you've just released a report on food security, Australia's food security. What we've seen during these floods is that farmers who'd come out of the drought on the east coast and were expecting a massive bumper harvest of wheat are now worried about severe damage to the crop because of the flooding rain. So the problem is they're going to say that we're in different cycles that we've always had, that this has nothing to do with global warming. The problem from the point of view of that argument.
Well, it's a great concern to me, actually. I think that some of the communities at most risk are our rural communities with global warming, with climate change in general. And in fact, we see that farmers will suffer. They will suffer when flooding events become more severe, and they will suffer through increased and prolonged droughts. So this is a sector that I'm quite concerned about, and I think that what the new report shows, which is a report to the Prime Minister's Science, Engineering and Innovation Council, is that the time has come to think about food security in Australia, to think about how we need to look at it from an integrated approach, because, of course, food security isn't just about having enough food in general, but really having a sustainable and reliable supply of affordable and nutritious food for everyone.
So what does the report say about what should happen in the Murray-Darling Basin, where very controversially water restrictions are being proposed on farmers who've been farming there for generations, even though the river itself is now back in flood in many areas?
Well, the remit of the report was not to look at the Murray-Darling Basin in particular. As you know, there are other reports that have looked into that specific issue. But rather, this report looked at general issues. And one of the things that it did recommend is looking at an integrated use of land. Land can be used and is used as a catchment for water, to produce food and fiber, to house rural communities, and increasingly to sequester carbon. And so what we need to think about is how to use our land wisely, because the population is rising, but the amount of arable land is staying constant. In fact, it's being encroached upon by urban areas, in part due to that population growth. And so farmers are facing many challenges, and they are going to need help. They are going to need help from the research and development sector to help increase the productivity as the challenges that they face increase.
But do you have a report or scientific advice for those farmers in the Murray-Darling who are essentially being told they may have to pack up their farms and stop being farmers because of climate change and restrictions to water in the future, even though they're looking at large volumes of water now?
I think that holistically, Australia will have to ask questions about what sort of food it can grow, where it can grow, and how it can increase productivity. We've seen great productivity increases in the 1970s, for example, in the agricultural sector here and around the world that was largely based on research and development into how to increase productivity, for example, through genetics, through dryland agriculture, which Australia is very well known for. We should be proud that productivity increases have continued to rise in the agricultural sector until the last few years, where that's leveled off. Nevertheless, the population has increased. And so I think a big part of the answer has to be how to use our land wisely, how to use our water wisely, and how to increase the research and development into doing better.
All right.
And if I could add one more thing,
Yes,
Tony,
sure.
I would say that we all need to use our food more wisely. 40% of food produced in Australia is wasted somewhere along the food chain.
Let me just go to one other key recommendation briefly of your report, and that is for the establishment of an Australian Food Security Agency. Now, wouldn't an agency like that simply be duplicating what's already done by the CSIRO, for example?
The report recommends a national approach to food that would go far beyond what one research agency, including a wonderful one like the CSIRO, can do. It's really looking at all of the sorts of things that affect that sector, whether it be regulation, whether it be policy development, whether it be R&D, and thinking not only about what happens at the paddock level, but all along the food chain through transport and delivery of healthy, nutritious food to the table.
Do you expect to see the government establish this new agency then?
The government will be considering this report at the next Prime Minister's meeting of this council on 4 February. So we look forward to hearing what the governmental response will be.
Okay, let's move on. Penny Sackett, as a scientist, are you afraid of nuclear power?
I'm certainly not afraid of nuclear power. Nuclear power is in use in many places of the world. France, for example, relies strongly on nuclear power.
Yeah, I ask that question because the political arguments about nuclear power are often based on fear, and particularly the fear of someone having a nuclear power plant put in a suburb near them or in their neighbourhood or even in their electorate. So it's very hard, because of this fear, this political fear, to ever see nuclear power seriously debated in this country.
Well, I think that we have to look at a suite of options, and in fact, resilience, which is another recurring theme not only for the food security report that I mentioned, but the second one that was released today by the Prime Minister's Science and Engineering Council on energy, water, and carbon. Resilience in the face of an uncertain future suggests that a suite of opportunities, whether including energy options, is what we need to look at, and not simply be reliant on a single form of energy.
So would it be wrong then to rule out a serious debate on nuclear energy, which of course is emissions free, at a time when you're trying to dramatically reduce emissions in this country?
I think that it would be reasonable to expect that over the next year, 2, 3 years, we'll be hearing increasing debate about all sorts of forms of energy that Australia should be looking at. And again, I think most of the scientific and economic evidence points to embracing a portfolio approach, that is, a suite of energy options that will likely change with time as new technology comes on board and as we learn more and more about the relationship between different forms of energy and other factors. For example, we need to look at the water use of energy systems, particularly in Australia, where water is so scarce. So the question is not only how much energy will it produce and how cheaply, but how much water will be used in producing that energy.
Okay,
that's a particularly important question for Australia.
What's your opinion as to whether or not Australia should look seriously at nuclear power?
It's my opinion that Australia should look carefully at all of the options.
Including nuclear power?
I think Australia should look at all of the options, Tony. And nuclear is one that's been discussed. Wind energy, there's a report released today, I think by ATSI, one of the academies of Australia, suggesting that wind power at the moment is another one that we should be looking at carefully. Of course, we want to think about how we can use coal in the short term in a cleaner way. Gas, I have no doubt, will continue to be an important part of the mix. So really, it's the suite. And I think that what we mustn't do is become fixated on asking, can one particular energy solution solve all of our problems? The answer to that is almost certainly no.
If the government asked for your advice as a chief scientist on whether nuclear power is a viable option for Australia and whether it would be beneficial, what would you say?
I'd say that we would need to study it. We would need to get a series of experts in who would look not only at nuclear energy but a whole suite of energy options and provide a report back. But I certainly wouldn't be answering the question without looking carefully at the evidence.
Given the level of global commitments to emissions reductions and nowhere near what scientists believe are necessary to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, how urgent do you think it is, as a scientist, to get serious commitments for emissions reduction targets far beyond what's now being talked about?
I think that the time is now to not only get those commitments, but to begin to act on working toward those commitments. Because it isn't simply the promise, it's actually the delivery of clean energy systems, of healthy ecosystems, of reforestation. And I'm pleased to say that I've just returned from a trip to the United States and to Mexico, where subnational leaders, governors, mayors, and so forth, are beginning to take those kinds of actions in their local community. And so this is heartening, and I think that it shows that there are communities all around the world that are beginning to take action now.
The Australian government is currently promising a 5% emissions reduction target. Do you regard that as a serious target that will achieve anything?
I regard any action that begins to reduce our emissions of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere as serious. Any reduction. Because right now, Tony, there is no reduction. Right now, the world total emission of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases is increasing every single year. And so I think the first step is to turn that around by any reduction. And by doing that, we will learn. And as we learn more, we'll be able to turn that curve around faster and faster.
Penny Sackett, rarely in history have we seen a situation where science and scientific opinion have had such a huge impact on public policy. Do you believe that scientists need to get more engaged in the political debate on climate change action?
I'm not so sure that they need to get more engaged in the political debate. I do think they need to get more engaged in the informed debate generally with their fellow citizens and with those that have been charged by those citizens to make decisions. That doesn't necessarily mean that they need to be engaged in politics, but I do think they need to be talking to politicians and they need to be talking to their fellow citizens. Yes, I do.
Penny Sackett, we'll have to leave you there. We thank you very much for taking the time to come and talk to us tonight on Lateline.
Thank you. It was a great pleasure, Tony.